Okay. Okay, we are going to start with, well, I don't know, Laureen, if you want to go over the review or do you want to go right into Principle 15?
Sometimes it's such a good idea. I think it's worth just saying really quickly. It's kind of like when we last left our fair heroes. This is, kind of that sort of feel. So let's take a minute and talk about, and again, as we keep talking about natural law, I just think it's so good to look at these principles in a lens of statements of natural law. They for me have become, you can test and measure that there will be certain predictable consequences if you follow this or if you don't. So to me, that means they're statements of natural law, these principles. And so we taught, in fact, the very first one was that the best government will be based on natural law. That any law that is not that is not going to work for a group of people. And then the second principle was that to be free in a republic, people need to be moral and virtuous so that they can govern themselves. It's back to that self-government idea. And then the third is that the most virtuous people will elect virtuous leaders. There's a correlation between good leadership and the virtue of the people. The fourth principle has to do with religion and the need for religion in good government, because religion is a self-regulator, an internal regulator of human behavior. And then the fifth principle is that we are equally dependent on God as our creator, which means that we're all on the same plane of being flawed. And because we are beneath him in wisdom, in stature, and power, and all of those things, we are also accountable to him and dependent on him, besides both of those things. And then the sixth principle talks about that we're all equal because of that. Under God, we are all equal, and there shouldn't be unequal privilege. That actually goes into the seventh principle, that government should actually protect the equality of rights between people, but not necessarily, they can't guarantee the equality of outcomes. That will never be actual freedom. Then the eighth principle is that there's certain rights that are unalienable, which means they come with us. They're a part of who we are and can't be taken from us with impunity. They're taken from people regularly, but people will answer to God for that, is what the founders believed. The ninth principle has to do with divine law, which sometimes the founders would use to delineate from natural law as far as the laws of nature and the universe and the laws of human behavior. But they felt like both of them were natural in their consequences and both as eternal and timeless. The 10th principle has to do with that the power comes from people, the body of the people. And then the 11th principle, this is always the one I forget, Stacy, every single time.
This is the majority of the people can
Okay.
alter or abolish the government,
I was afraid I was wrong. Thank you.
which has become tyrannical, that is.
Yes, and it says this right in the Declaration of Independence. When a government becomes tyrannical, it can be not just the
It's your
right
duty.
of the people to say, we want a different government than this. It's also their duty to change it so that you can have that accountability to God about the way you used your agency, which is really chilling when you think about, to take tyranny lying down is to answer to God someday about that. President Benson has talked about that. And then the 12th principle is the difference between a republic and a democracy that we talked about. And the 13th principle is so timeless. The Constitution, actually, one of the biggest purposes of the Constitution was to limit the power of those who wrote it. So they felt like that government had to have protections in it to guard people against the frailties, the flaws, the ambition, the greed of their leaders. And then the 14th principle that we ended with was private property, the importance of private property, that is paramount to freedom and usually where tyrants start in their erosion of individual rights. So
Perfect.
I think I got an A on that quiz.
I think you did good.
Maybe 95. I don't know, that 11, I always get a little shaky on that one.
Well, starting today, we're going to talk about the 15th principle, and this is one that has just been, you see what they have done to degrade the founders. That this is one that has just totally been maligned, and that is that the highest level of prosperity occurs when there is a free market economy and a minimum of government regulations. And what the founders I think most of you probably have heard of the book, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And we structured our whole national economy on the basis of natural law and the free market concept that was described by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. And so in here, he talks about certain things, and part of this formula that he called for is that you would have specialized production. I'm sorry, I've got Laureen right in the way. Specialized production, let each person or corporation of persons do what they do best.
That means
And
you can choose to do what you feel is good for the benefit of the economy.
an exchange of goods takes place in a free market environment without governmental interference. And listen to this, in production, they don't tell you how much you need to produce, in your prices or your wages. The government stays out of that. Sorry.
Hope you're not
The
drinking
free market,
snorting it when you hear any of these.
yeah. The free market provides the needs to the people on the basis of supply and demand with no government imposed monopolies. That's something that we have totally lost. If you look around today, we're in trouble in that way. And then these companies gain so much power, not just so much power to, like, let's say, put other people out of business, but they have just a high degree of say in our government and in the laws that are passed. Prices are regulated by competition on the basis of supply and demand. You know, I taught this to my kids because when I was young, I just told my dad, I have got to have this computer. It was called a compact computer. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it, but it was like a suitcase. You opened it up and there was this little teeny screen. And I said, I've got to have it. My dad said, just wait, the price will come down. It was $3,200. It barely did anything, barely did anything. Now you can buy one, you know, as there was more competition. There's all kinds of different people who are producing computers. And because of that, you can now buy that for, you know, like $500. Profits are looked upon as the means by which production of goods and services is made worthwhile. So
That's
yeah,
not a bad thing.
are motivating. That's what makes you, you know, that's where you find your success. If you're not making a profit, you change the way you design it, or else, you know, you look for something else. Because if you're continually propped up and you're a company that's making no money, you know, that's kind of like a socialist company. And if you look around, you can see many things where government has put money into or changed laws to help these companies because they, well, for whatever reason they have. And those companies have made nothing for years and years and years and years. We've heard that, you know, solar or whatever was going to be the next best thing, and tons of money has been poured into it. But if it were really doing what we all wanted, then they would work. But when you start to look at how much the government is involved, generally you find those companies that aren't doing that well. Competition is looked upon as the means by which quality is improved, quantity is increased, and prices are reduced. That
And
is
that
the main,
always happens when the market is left alone.
when the market is left alone. Exactly.
The founders talked about 4 basic laws, and they're so simple to remember, of economic freedom. And you can see this when we put these up on the screen. The first one is that you've got the freedom to buy. Oh, excuse me, first one is try. I knew there was a rhyme. Excuse me, buy.
Yeah.
You can try things. You don't have to be afraid that there's so many regulations you can't even open a business. Then you have the freedom to buy, and that there's not an inhibition of that, so that new products can be welcomed into the market. And if people like it, they can buy it. So that means there's got to be the freedom to sell too. And that gives you an incentive to enlarge the market. And the biggest one that's forgotten, and we really started to see this after 2008. There was a little bit of that before, but that was when I was first aware of it. Of course, I was kind of out of it before then. That's when I started paying attention more. But the freedom to fail is so big, because then if what that means is that the marketplace would be a place of meritocracy, where if it was a good product at a good price that helped people, then it would flourish. And if it didn't, you'd have to go back to the drawing board and find something else. In fact, Walter Williams was an economist that he had a syndicated column for years, and said before the free market, the only way you could amass wealth was to plunder it from somebody else. It was only when you looked, what can I do to serve my fellow man and make money at it? That's when it was free market that really changed, where not everybody just lived from hand to mouth, which is really an interesting.
We've
Now,
created the middle class, really.
that's what created the middle class. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, go
So
ahead. Stacy loves this.
I do love this one, and I want you to take a picture of it. This is what I always say. You should take a picture of this slide and you should have it at your fingertips, because by 1905, the US, this is only like 116 years after the beginning of our country. Think about all of the different countries in the Eastern Hemisphere that have been around forever. By 1905, the US was the richest industrial nation in the world, with only 5% of the Earth's continental land area and 6% of the world's population. The US was producing over half of almost everything. And, you know, think about the charity that this nation has given to the world, the most charitable nation in the world. And I know that there's a lot of textbooks that will try to make it look like, you know, we have gone about this all wrong and that we are plundering from others. It's not true. This is one of the biggest things that I talk to people about, because you can say, okay, well, these were the founders and they're dead, and we have a new, you know, they weren't aware of what was coming, and you know, we don't need to get into the Constitution so much because we've just come so far. And you say, well, okay, so you tried something new, you know, so we've tried something new. We have moved away from constitutional principles now for over 100 years. The question is, what are the fruits? What are the fruits of the way we did do it compared to the fruits of what we have now? And anybody that doesn't mind thinking would say, we've got to turn back because it's not working. We're printing $1 trillion every 100 days. That's
every time
just the opposite of this.
Yeah, it's the opposite of this.
And I'm sorry, we have an example from the Book of Mormon because we just got so excited when we found it. But if you guys want to ever look at Helaman 6, the very first half of that chapter.
That is a free market chapter.
That is a free market chapter. We'll just move from there, but anyway. Go ahead.
So Adam Smith, that was a contemporary of the founders, remember, he was from Scotland, and the founders agreed with him that the greatest threat to economic prosperity is the arbitrary intervention of the government into the economic affairs of private businesses and the buying public, for example. And like I said, I hope your head doesn't explode when you read this, because it's like, it's like, how can we do this wrong? And I have something to say about that in just a second. Look at this list. Fixed prices. These are the things they should not do. Again, don't be drinking soda right now. Fixed wages, controlling production. I mean, there are farmers who are told to not till their land now. Controlling production or distribution, granting monopolies, creating monopolies, or subsidizing certain products, just like what Stacy was talking about earlier. There were only 4 exceptions. Now, we were putting this presentation and this class together right at the height of when the Affordable Care Act was going into practice. And every one of these things was happening or being caused to happen in that Affordable Care Act. And now keep that in your mind when you think these were the times the government was supposed to intervene rather than the government was supposed to facilitate this from happening. There was supposed to be no force in the marketplace, so the government should intervene to make sure there was no force. Well, the Affordable Care Act forced you to have certain product, so you shouldn't be compelled. Fraud, anything that was misinterpreted by its quality or its location or what it actually was going to be providing or the ownership of the item that was being sold or bought. There's so much massive misrepresentation in that 2,000-page bill. It was not supposed to have any kind of monopoly going on. So, and it's created monopolies, that bill. Just this one example of one bill.
Well, just one example of that is just in the healthcare industry. My friend, who shall remain nameless, found when she was arguing about her health care, which forced her to have certain parts that she did not need, talked to them until finally they said, well, there used to be 400. We used to be able to choose between about 400 different healthcare policies. We can now choose between 7.
So that bill limited our choices.
Yeah.
And finally, debauchery. of cultural standards and moral fiber of society. So any kind of commercial exploitation of vice, such as pornography, obscenity, drugs, liquor, prostitution, and gambling. But we would also add abortion, because there is stuff I mean, we subsidize abortion as a federal government now. Our taxpayer money subsidizes it. So the government was supposed to only step in to prevent those things. And now we have an economy where the government facilitates and enables those things and actually creates them. And the thing I was going to say earlier that I wanted to mention, that this is the way my brain works. I was thinking one day about that expression that says that a broken clock is still right twice a day. So even a completely broken thing manages to get it right, at 2 times in a day. So when I look at lists like this, and we're always wrong, to me, that is actually what put my mind to think there's another agenda. It's not like there's two sides of this coin where how are we going to get to the same place? It's the thing that made me realize there really are people in this country that are trying to get to a different place. And what that place was to me was a place of force that is not, that inhibits freedom, that idea, because they're always wrong as far as some of these principles go.
Yeah.
So after 1900, this is really fascinating. Adam Smith got lost, and we laugh because, again, Skousen is so darling and optimistic. He called it get lost in the shuffle. As we've studied this, we realize that is so optimistic because some of the people who had the most money stood to gain from ignoring it. So it was like, we feel like it was a lot more intentional than Skousen thinks, but that's just us. In spite of the fact that the fruits of the free market economy were making the United States the biggest and the richest industrial nation in the world, like that 1905 played, wealthy industrialists, heads of multinational banking institutions, leaders in the academic world, and media people, this is in the United States, as well as similar circles in Europe, started to doubt the effectiveness of Smith's principles. And again, that is Skousen talking. I don't think they doubted it. They were in their way of amassing the more wealth and power than they wanted. Go ahead, Stacy.
So just some of the problems were that there were large-scale strikes, there was rise of powerful trusts, there were I thought that was fun, mysterious recurrence of boom and bust cycles, rise of new populist movement in which certain agriculture and labor groups were demanding that the government get involved in the redistribution of wealth. And then here Skousen says many of these problems were either caused or aggravated by the very people who were demanding a new system. The new system would involve extensive government regulation, if not outright expropriation of major industries and natural resources. So if you can cause this problem to happen, and then you step in with the solution, those are the people who benefit. Those are always the people who benefit.
The solution is to kick the very door shut that was open for you to go through and amass your wealth.
In Europe, certain confederations of wealthy families had gained control of their respective governments and were making a financial killing. Some of the wealthy families in America coveted the rich government monopolies of their transatlantic cousins. And here they talked about the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. Do you remember that we talked about them a few weeks or last week? They were billed on major university campuses as the vanguard of the new era. Collectivism, socialism, government ownership of industry, subsidy of the farmers, and a whole spectrum of similar ideas were permeating the country when World War I broke out. This greatly accelerated the idea of strong centralized government. We're going to need you because we're going to war, with regulatory power over every aspect of the marketplace. It just seems like there's always got to be some major catastrophe that will then help grab a few more of the rights of the people and move away from constitutional principles.
John Chamberlain was more of a contemporary of Skousen, it sounds like, as we've looked at dates. So he was a late 20th century writer, and he began his education during the 1920s. And listen what he said about his college courses in economics. So we never read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which right off, if we knew even, I mean, we've never read it. We've just read.
I read some of it.
But we gasp at that. To think of throwing that out of economics college courses is crazy. And the best economic minds of the 20th century didn't. Von Mises, Hayek, Thomas Sowell, Milton Friedman, the ones that are sensible all still read The Wealth of Nations. But imagine generations of people starting to come through college economics courses and never reading this. We heard plenty about it, however. The professors treated it condescendingly. We were told it was the fundamentalist Bible of the old dog eat dog type of businessman. And see, that is a seed of communist thinking, that profit is evil and dog eat dog. And it's not dog eat dog, it's that natural survival of the fittest belongs in the free market because you want the good products to survive and the bad products to phase out. So this went hand in hand with the objectives of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. This is Skousen now talking about his contemporary. Chamberlain eventually came to realize what the intellectual leaders of the day were doing. They were deprecating the founders and the free market economy to create a vacuum, which would then be filled with a completely new formula. So you take out the correct principles because then you can't quite as easily spot the counterfeit. Their new economic nostrum was the very toxin that the founders had warned against.
Chamberlain believed we would have been saved so much trouble if we had only been compelled to read and digest The Wealth of Nations in a first college course in economics, with James Madison's political theory as a side dressing. Smith's book is indeed the beginnings of everything that is important to economic theory. And this is Milton Friedman, who Laureen just talked about. He was an economist and he won the Nobel Prize in economics. And listen, we have a short video for you to listen to. And listen to what he says, you know, when he says that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear.
And notice how he catches the incorrect principles that are being thrown at him. It's never personal with him. It's never about personalities. He just goes right to the heart of, oh, no, you see, you've gone off the beam here. It's never personal. He's just brilliant. We just love him.
And this is just a little throwback. Some
Yeah,
of
to
you
the
probably
70s.
have never even heard of Phil Donahue, but he was on this talk show.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
But it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think the communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us. Well, I don't even trust you to do that.
Isn't that perfect?
Awesome.
Once we listen to that, I just search him on YouTube and listen to him because he's brilliant and fun to listen to at the same
Fun to
time.
listen to. And did you notice it was never adversarial? They just stuck with the principles. He just knows how to stick with the principles. And may I say, there's someone I love listening to now. Charlie Kirk is that way. He is never adversarial, ever. I'm just so impressed when they know. So Skousen said at the Constitutional Convention, so remember that was in the summer of 1787, the founders determined that they would make the American dollar completely independent of any other power or combination of powers outside of the American people, so that they didn't have to rely on what was happening in the world. Not only was Congress to be held responsible for the issuing of the money, but it was to see that its purchasing power remained fixed. That has not happened, by the way.
So the founders were never able to adequately implement sound banking that didn't allow for a central bank to control the currency or operate on fractional lending. And fractional lending is something that you guys might want to spend some time looking up, but it's pretty much that the banks only have to keep a fraction of what you deposit and then they lend it all out. And so if everything comes crashing down, which it has, then that's when the government starts to step in and prop up certain banks at the cost of other banks. And little by little, you start to see some of the local banks being eaten up by these bigger banks that are being propped up. So it's something to look at.
The founders didn't believe that anybody was too big to fail.
No, the issuing of money was turned over, okay, to a private consortium of bankers who set up a privately owned bank called the Bank of the United States. And today we have a similar arrangement with the Federal Reserve System. And, you know, I wrote a report on the Federal Reserve System in college and still never understood that the Federal Reserve is a private bank. It has nothing to do with the federal government. It's owned by private bankers and
It's
was
a
set up
cartel.
in 1913.
It's a banking cartel. If you want some really great information about this, there is a YouTube video, and I'll send it in the weekly email if you've given me your email. Ed Griffin is just so fun to listen to because he's so knowledgeable. And he wrote a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island, and it talks about the founding of the Federal Reserve System. And he gave about an hour-long speech that's kind of, sometimes when I think I'm not going to get to a book because there's too many books, I sometimes will look the person up and see if they've spoken about it or had an interview about it or something. And yeah, that's actually how I learned about the book, was listening to this. But that's a great way to understand really the corruption behind the Federal Reserve System.
So Skousen said the indignant protest of Thomas Jefferson can be heard across the vista of 2 whole centuries because he warned against this over and over again. He said, if the American people, listen to this, if the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation, check, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied. The issuing power of money should be taken from the banks and restored to Congress and the people to whom it belongs. Remember that they wanted Congress to do it so that it wouldn't have this pendulum of swinging so much. That's why they wanted Congress to do it. And then these bankers, and when you learn about it and the kind of trickery as to how they did it, they're the ones who are just gaining all kinds of wealth while we are losing our wealth through inflation and deflation and stagnation and all of these things. So Jefferson was brilliant that way. He warned against it. Jefferson, Jackson, and Lincoln all tried to get the monetary program turned around so that Congress would issue its own money and banks would be required to loan on existing assets rather than use fictitious money. And just when it was getting close to catching on, listen to this from the London Times. He puts London Times frantic editorial. If that mischievous financial policy, which had its origin in the North American Republic during the late war in that country, which was a civil war, should become indurated down to a fixture, they're nervous about this, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off its debt and be without debt. So far, it sounds good to me. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous beyond precedent in the history of the civilized governments of the world. The brains and the wealth of all countries will go to North America. That government must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe. So they were afraid of that being a thing for us because they could see, what kind of a country we would become. And I just think about that. There's a book I kind of want to tell you to read. And you just, everybody gets nervous when they hear this word, but it's called None Dare Call It a Conspiracy.
I agree.
And it is one of the best books you will ever read if you want to see what has gone on in this country and in other countries by these certain groups of people that are really pulling all the strings. It very well footnoted, just a wonderful book that Ezra Taft Benson, who was a prophet in our church, also the Secretary of Agriculture, actually recommended when he gave a conference address that people read that book, and it is very enlightening.
I would add, we read this last year. My husband and I read it. We were on a road trip and we could read the whole thing on our road trip. And it was co-written by two men. One of those men went on to update it about 15 years after the original book was written in 1971. So and I had to chuckle at the name of the 1985 edition. It's called Call It Conspiracy. Like, we just have to say it's a conspiracy. And it's almost verbatim, it is verbatim, the first several chapters, but then he's put updates at the end of each of those chapters. And then there's additional chapters picking up where they left off in 1971 and going up to 1985. They're both very good, but I'm thinking you could get everything in the first one if you picked up Call It Conspiracy. That was a long one.
Yeah, this one's shorter.
It's an important one. So the 16th principle, the 16th and 17th really go back to back, and they're so lost now. The government should be separated into three branches. So this is that talking about the separation of powers, so that all had different roles: the legislative, the executive, and judicial. And those of you that know the Constitution, that represents those first articles of the Constitution. Polybius was one of the great Greek historians that saw an element of genius in each of different types of government. He could see the power of a monarchy, especially during a war, that there needs to be some decisions made quickly by one person. He could see the genius of having an aristocracy, those who create wealth, create jobs, support economies, being represented so that the people who are creating the wealth have a say. But he could also see that democracy had an element of genius to it because that would represent the masses. Now remember, pure democracies always end in mob rule, but he could see that all three of those had benefits and would actually write. He said he was aware that each form carried within itself the seed of its own degeneration if it were allowed to operate without some sort of checks and balances provided by opposing principles or bodies. And that's why 16 and 17 go together, because the checks and balances come up in the next one. So you can see a monarchy is very easily turned into a tyranny, as actually an aristocracy could. We would actually call that an oligarchy now, where just a few rich families make all the decisions. And then, of course, we've talked about how the democracy is so easy to turn into violence, which, like I said, very often will serve someone who wants to be a tyrant so that they can be the hero and end the lack of law and order.
Polybius felt that if these three departments set up as coordinated equals, they could perform their necessary functions, but at the same time counterbalance one another as a restraining mechanism, so that no one of them would acquire sufficient power to abuse the people. A monarchy could be like the executive branch, an aristocracy, the Senate, and a democracy, a popular assembly, or our legislative branch.
And notice they're the ones we vote for every 2 years.
Yeah.
To keep them closer to us. The idea sort of died with Polybius, but resurfaced when 18th century writers, so this would have been a century before the founders. No, same century, forgive me. I get the centuries mixed up sometimes. Charles de Montesquieu was a French political writer, and he felt like the possibility, sorry, I'm reading at the bottom. He put forth that practical possibility of a government based on a separation of powers or a mixed constitution where all of those things existed, which is what we have. He also envisioned a government with an executive, a split legislative, and an independent judiciary branch, which the founders really liked. And remember, the original Articles of Confederation that were too weak to hold the country together had no executive or judiciary provisions. Congress was composed of representatives from the states, but it had no taxing or enforcement powers. So it was almost like a committee, and so nobody really had to do it.
When the
So-
legislative, oh,
Okay,
sorry.
go ahead.
Go. Okay. When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may arise lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. Again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and executive. Were it joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would then be the legislator. Were it joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with violence and oppression. So he's just saying you can't have it all in one. And we
And
talked about that.
Because of human nature, what you're reading there sounds very prophetic, but it's just this extrapolation of, okay, if you do this, this is what human nature is gonna produce. Because if you read that, did you think, well, that's what we've got now? So it serves as this huge prophetic warning, because human nature will always, as unpredictable as human nature is, there's certain things you can always count on it doing. So I don't know, I think that's so wise. Benjamin Franklin was one of the last to be converted, but he finally acknowledged that the Constitution of the United States, with this separating of powers, was as perfect as man could be expected to produce, which is really tender to us because we know that he agrees with Jesus Christ about that scripture from the 101st section of the Doctrine and Covenants. So this talks about the checks and balances within those powers now.
Okay, so a system of checks and balances should be adopted to prevent the abuse of power. And the Federalist Papers, this is kind of fun. Madison had to spend 5 Federalist Papers explaining the checks and balances. And I don't know how many of you have read the Federalist Papers or attempted to read them. I know that hardly anybody that I know has ever picked up the Federalist Papers. When I asked them for my birthday, I got laughed at. But what I want to say is, after we read these 5 quotes, you can now say, I've read part of the Federalist Papers, and that sounds good. Oops. Okay, so this is Federalist 47. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So it doesn't really matter how you got there. If you get there where it's all in the same hands, no matter what, it is a tyranny.
That's what we don't have a free country anymore. Those are the kind of statements that make you go, you can test and measure that. Just because you can go to work.
We have
and
some
choose what you
freedoms.
do, we have some freedoms, but not the
Not what
kind
we did.
that the founders felt like mattered.
So
want me to read
Federalist 48 was, it will not be denied that power is of an encroaching nature, and of course we know that, and that it ought to be effectually restrained from passing the limits assigned to it. The next and most difficult task is to provide some practical security for each against the invasion of the others. You need to have enough power in each branch so that they can push back, so that they can hold people at bay. It's when we give up what our duties are and we don't push back that we start to get this tyranny. Go
So
ahead.
what's happening now, where we've moved away from some of these principles, and like I said, it'll feel like you're reading the newspaper, even though Skousen wrote this book in 2005. The judiciary has created new laws. It's been called judicial legislation or legislating from the bench by pretending to merely interpret old ones. In fact, many people we know that have been studied law say that's all they ever talk about is precedent now. That's what they study.
And now they're talking about international law, which of course
Which
has
is
nothing to
just
do with the
beyond
Constitution.
eerie. Run for the hills for that one. Presidents have made thousands of new laws instead of Congress by issuing executive orders. They've become far more common than they ever were.
I just want to say one thing about that, is just we have to be very careful about that because, you know, when we have the president that we've elected, we don't tend to get as nervous when he issues an executive order. And we got to be able to call it out regardless, because people will say, "Oh, Stacey, isn't it wonderful? He signed this executive order." I'm like, well, it's not really that wonderful, because an executive order that's signed by the president is just signed away by the next president. You can't have anything that you trust or hold on to, and you bypass the people altogether. Go ahead.
The federal government has been allowed to invade the reserved rights of the states on a massive scale. That one is huge. That the 9th and 10th Amendment was supposed to protect the states' rights as sovereign bodies. And that has, so been lost. This is one of the brightest. We were really excited to discover him 10-ish years ago when we were first doing this class. He actually, we need to bring in someone contemporary to explain who he is, because there was something that President Obama had done that really was unconstitutional and threatened constitutional precedent. And Jonathan Turley actually as a professor of George Washington University, was speaking before this House Judiciary Committee about this thing that Obama had done. And like I said, we don't want to go into the details of it because it's the principle we're concerned about. The reason this caught our attention is because he voted for Obama and he agrees with Obama's agenda. So I think we really liked using that as an example of how important it is to stick with the principles. And that thing that Stacey was saying, when it's someone on your side, then you feel like justified going, well, this is great because it furthered our agenda. But even someone who agreed with the agenda said this in a Judiciary Committee. The president has become the very danger that separation of powers was designed to avoid. And we should not take from future generations a system that has safeguarded our freedoms for over 250 years. He's one of the most measured voices on the left that we have found.
So these are the checks that we have on power, constitutional checks, okay, that each branch of government has and that we have. And the first check is us, the people. Our people will just say, well, we need term limits, which, you know, of course, at this point, we would all champion, but the term limits are from us if we're paying attention.
They're
We
supposed to
can
be.
remove House members every 2 years by our vote. We can remove the president every 4 years and the Senate every 6 years if we're paying attention and participating like we should be. And then here, the executive, their checks on power, the president has veto power, and he can withhold re-election support, and he can use discretionary power for the building of military bases, dams, and improving roads and rivers. That's really where his checks end, okay?
That's it.
And the judiciary over here checks legislation by reviewing laws to determine their constitutionality. So that's not very many, but here we have the House of Representatives, or the Senate and the House of Representatives. Look at all those checks, and that's because that's the people's house. That's the people have the power, we the people. And see if you think any of these are happening. I'm sure some are, but there's so many that they have, that they are not
so eroded. So eroded.
The House can check the Senate and the Senate can check the House. You can check a presidential veto with a 2/3 vote when it comes back. If he vetoes, you can go at it again if you can get 2/3 of the vote. Here's one. Check president with appropriations funding. Congress controls the purse. If you don't like what he's doing, you don't have to fund it. Instead of just putting on a show and arguing back and forth, you cannot fund it. Now, of course, that's always scary because every time they say they're going to do it, then that president, whomever it is, will then threaten to shut down, and they'll make a big thing and it will look like it's, you know, the Congress's fault. But if you understand this, that is what we're supposed to do. We are trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, and we shouldn't be going along with the emotional arguments of the media. If somebody says they're going to shut down the government if we don't fund this, we should be very careful about what we're funding.
Thank you for saying that too, Stacey, because the media really has painted when the government did shut down or where they threatened that it is going to shut down, that it's Congress's fault. And it's not. It is within their purview to say, you can't have a blank check. And so when they've tried to do that, the media has painted it that it's their fault rather than the president essentially having a temper tantrum until he gets his way.
Yes. So I will actually let you just read through this list so that we go on and we don't spend too much time. But there's just a lot of things in here that we could do better if we even understood what our representatives are supposed to be doing, so that we can send in letters that say, don't fund it, don't fund it. If they think that the people are saying, don't fund it, then they don't have to worry about what the media says. But if we're not paying attention and all we do is listen to, the media source of our choice, we get caught up in emotional arguments. We need to have the principles so that we can avoid the emotional arguments. And here, the states also have a check. And here's where we really lost a lot of power. And most people don't understand this, and I did not understand this. But we never were supposed to vote for senators. We weren't supposed to vote for the President of the United States. The way our system was set up is we voted for our representatives. And our state legislators chose the senators. And so when the state legislators chose the senators, then that's why the senators had to come back and give a speech and talk and be accountable to what they had voted for. And if the state legislature is saying, I don't understand why you're voting for a turtle bridge in Florida, spending all this money that then Utah is being taxed for, we're going to get rid of you. We're going to get somebody who will vote to represent our state. That's how it used to be. And I used to think, well, I think I should vote. And then you think, really? Because how informed are you? How informed are we? How much of this, what it's turned into now is those with the most money is who funds my campaign. That's who I'm going to try to please when I'm in Congress. But if I'm trying to please my state, if I'm trying to, please the people of my state, and you just save millions and millions of election money, and it was brilliant the way the founders set it up. But because of that, we've lost a lot of power with our states. And then the other check that they have is that 3/4 of the states are needed to ratify constitutional amendments. If you want to have an amendment, you can do that if you can get 3/4 of the states to go with you. Go ahead, Laurie.
Washington's farewell address said, it is important likewise that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon the other. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create whatever the form of government, a real despotism. So call it what you like, that will be despotism. A just estimate of that love of power and proneness to abuse it, which predominates in the human heart, is sufficient to satisfy us of the truth of the position. When I say it sounds like these men have the 121st section of the Doctrine and Covenants on their hearts, it's statements like this that make me think that they understand it's just what humans do when they think they've got a little bit of power. He finishes, to preserve these reciprocal checks must be as necessary as to institute them. So you can set them up all you like, but it's preserving them that's going to be the trick. But let there be no change, listen to this, by usurpation, just taking them. For though this in one instant may be the instrument of good, it is customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. And you can look even in your own lifetime, the worst decisions that have taken our freedoms away have always been done under the name of an emergency.
Skousen said, once a constitution has been established and the machinery developed for remedy or repair by peaceful means, this is the most intelligent and satisfactory route to pursue. It requires more patience, but given time, the results are more certain. To solve problems by peaceful means was the primary purpose of the United States Constitution, and we still have it. And the more of us that understand it, the better chance we have of trying to restore things without it becoming a bloody battle. So the
He's
18th principle is that the unalienable rights of the people are most likely to be preserved if the principles of government are set forth in a written constitution. And we started right off the bat in 1620. The first written charter in America was the Mayflower Compact. And then there was the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which were adopted in 1639. And the interesting thing about this is that the Connecticut Charter makes no reference to the Crown or the British government as the source of its authority. It is a compact of we the people.
Skousen said, time has proven the tremendous advantage of having a completely written document for reference purpose, rather than relying upon tradition and a few scattered statutes as a fundamental law of the land, particularly as you see history being revised as it is happening.
Go ahead.
The 19th principle says that only limited and carefully defined powers should be delegated to the government. So you have, again, because they want to just cross over the line all the time and take and encroach more. So this is the line. This is what you can do. Really spell out their role. All others are retained by the people. So you can't just assume the power because it's a good idea. If it's not written here, it's not your role. Skousen said no principle was emphasized more vigorously during the Constitutional Convention than the necessity of limiting the authority of the federal government. They were all so skittish about this. And think about the Revolutionary War, and that makes perfect sense. One of the reasons many of the states would not adopt the original draft of the Constitution was that they feared the encroachments of the federal government on the rights of the states and the people. We think we talked about that's why the Federalist Papers were written in the first place. The first 10 amendments were therefore added so there could be no question as to the strictly limited authority that the people were conferring on their federal government. And like I said, our Congress has just abused those so badly. Listen what the 9th Amendment says. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So just because you don't see it listed here doesn't necessarily mean it's not one of our rights. And go ahead, Stacy.
So the 10th Amendment is one that has really been just kind of corrupted. And that is that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. This was in order to preserve the balance of power between the federal government and the states. And we'll see as we go on how this has kind of been turned on its head. But it's interesting because now almost everything seems to be federally controlled. And a lot of that is because they are dangling money in front of the states.
I was just going to say that as an example. We have about 7%. I want to say, I know it's under 10%. The number varies from year to year, I think, but it's close to 7% of Utah State's budget in a year. And what cracks me up is the budget comes from a bankrupt federal government. So we could just laugh about that before we even talked about this. But roughly 7% goes to education. And there are so many onerous, horrible policies coming out of the Department of Education. And all we would have to do to exercise our rights with that 10th Amendment and assert our rights as a state, as a sovereign state, is to say, we're going to come up with that money ourselves. But they act like that's our money, like it's sitting in an envelope in a box marked Utah in a little box of mailboxes in Washington, D.C., which we all know it isn't. And it's not enough to completely, it's just like taking money from a guy in an alley. You know, it's just, there are strings, baby, and they're bad strings. So we could get off, if we could get off federal money, we could be self-reliant again.
Utah state budget has about 26% from the federal government. So that's something to think about too as you vote. Well, Federalist number 15 said, there is in the nature of sovereign power an impatience of control that disposes those who are invested with the exercise of it to look with an evil eye upon all external attempts to restrain or direct its operations. We don't like people to tell us. This tendency is not difficult to be accounted for. It has its origin in the love of power. Power controlled or abridged is almost always the rival and enemy of that power by which it is controlled or abridged.
That makes perfect sense, doesn't it? You're gonna see someone as an enemy that's trying to control your behavior. So Jefferson said this about the 10th Amendment: to take a single step beyond the boundaries, thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress, is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. So once you break through that, it's like that nose of the camel in the tent. It's going to be out of control.
The capital and leading object of the Constitution was to leave with the states all authorities which respected their own citizens only, and to transfer to the United States those which respected citizens of foreign or other states. Can any good be effected by taking from the states the moral rule of their citizens and subordinating it to the general federal authority? My answer would be no. I wish, therefore, never to see all offices transferred to Washington, where further withdrawn from the eyes of the people, so you're just further away from you solving that problem, they may more secretly be bought and sold as at market. Such an intention was impossible and would break up the foundations of the Union. Our country is too large to have all its affairs directed by a single federal government. Public servants at such a distance and from under the eye of their constituents must, from the circumstance of distance, be unable to administer and overlook all the details necessary for the good government of the citizens, and will invite the public agents to corruption, plunder, and waste. You are too far away to solve our problems, and then it invites corruption, plunder, and waste. And I think you could put a check mark by all three of those.
You can cross out
Jefferson
will
was
invite
quite
and say
brilliant.
it has invited.
Yeah.
Hamilton said, this balance between the national and state government is of the utmost importance. It forms a double security to the people. So if one, federal or state, encroaches on their rights, they, the people, will find a powerful protection in the other. Indeed, they will both be prevented from overpassing their constitutional limits by certain rivalship which will ever subsist between them. So you could use one or the other to petition and say they're getting out of hand. And that's why I think a lot of people in the state are concerned, because we seem to just go with the federal instead of stand up to the federal when they're supposed to be our last resort.
These are some of the places where things began to go wrong, and we'll let you kind of look into this on your own. But the 14th Amendment weakened the rights of the states, and we cite here the Supreme Court Gitlow case, which again went against the 10th Amendment. The 17th Amendment changed the way we elect senators. We already talked about that. And then there's been a consolidation of the three branches of government. Jefferson considered states' rights a much more important and effective safeguard of people's liberties than the checks and balances among the three branches of the federal government. So he thought the states' rights were more important than those three checks, than the checks and balances. And for a good reason. While judicial review was intended to curb Congress and restrain the executive, in reality, the judicial, legislative, and executive, and he calls it unholy federal trinity, has simply colluded over time in an alliance that has helped abolish the 10th Amendment. So that last part was actually from the Mises Institute.
So the 20th principle says that efficiency and dispatch require government to operate according to the will of the majority, but constitutional provisions must be made to protect the rights of the minority, because they had seen majorities run over minorities in their founding of the country. Oh, go ahead, Stacey.
Unanimity is the ideal, but majority rule becomes a necessity. A flaw in the Articles of Confederation required all of the states to approve any changes. Everybody had to agree, or else it wasn't going to happen. So a single state was able to prevent necessary change from being adopted. So that was a big problem with the Articles of Confederation. Hamilton in the Federalist 22 said, to give a minority a negative upon the majority, which is always the case where more than a majority is requisite to a decision, is in its tendency to subject the sense of the greater number to that of the lesser number. The necessity of unanimity in public bodies or something approaching towards it has been founded upon a supposition that it would contribute to security. But the real operation is to embarrass the administration, to destroy the energy of the government, and to substitute the pleasure, caprice, or artifices of an insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junto to the regular deliberations and decisions of a respectable majority. The public business must in some way or other go forward. If a pertinacious minority can control the opinion of a majority, respecting the best mode of conducting it, the majority, in order that something may be done, must conform to the views of the minority. You can see how the minority has more power than the majority. And thus the sense of the smaller number will overrule that of the greater and give a tone to the national proceedings. Hence, tedious delays, continual negotiation and intrigue, contemptible compromises of the public good.
We've got a perfect example that we talked about when we quoted A.A. Hodges' sermon about in a public setting of school, that he who believes most must give way to him.
Which were the
that believes
majority.
Least. And then him that believes least has to give way to him that believes nothing at all. That is this principle exactly. That is how a minority rules. But the American founders had suffered enough from the tyrannical conduct of the parliament to feel highly sensitive to the rights of minorities. So boy, there is a balancing act. They were constantly striking. Jefferson said, all too will bear in mind this sacred principle that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal laws must protect, and to violate would be oppression. You can see again where principle 2 comes into play here, principle 3 comes into play here, principle 4 comes into play, because if we are virtuous people, we're not going to exploit or take advantage of or oppress someone because they're in the minority.
So
and
the
then this is our last one for tonight. We made it. Go ahead.
Yeah, the 21st principle, strong local self-government, is the keystone to preserving human freedom. And you know, we all get very keyed up about the presidential race and these national races, but I would just let you do your own little self-examination as to how many school board meetings you've been to, how many city council meetings you've been to. I myself am not good at this. We've been to a few school board meetings. I've been to a few city council meetings, but that's really where we have the most power. Skousen said political power automatically gravitates towards the center, and the purpose of the Constitution is to prevent that from happening. The centralization of political power always destroys liberty by removing the decision-making function from the people on the local level and transferring it to the officers of the central government. So every time you centralize things, and people will say, oh, well, it'll be cheaper for our our city, it will be, we'll save money this way, or else, we just can't get anything done. And people will make all kinds of reasons why they want to centralize, but it's always destroys liberty. This process gradually benumbs the spirit of volunteerism among the people, and they lose the will to solve their own problems because there's going to be a bureau, there's going to be an agency, somebody's going to help us. They also cease to be involved in community affairs, which is exactly what has happened.
You see, the more people get involved in community affairs, the less need there is for an agency or a bureau. And
Right.
Bureaus exist. They're very protective of their existence. And so they justify it by always having the problem. They justify it by always needing money. It's very hard to get rid of it once it's set up. So to go back to local is going to be the answer. A historian that Skousen quotes in the book, this Frothingham, said, in ancient England, local self-government is found in connection with the political and territorial divisions of the tithings, hundreds, burghs, counties, and shires. So one little republic after another, gets to be a bigger republic. That's what's so lovely about that, in which the body of inhabitants had a voice in managing their own affairs. Hence, it was the germinal idea of Anglo-Saxon polity. So this idea came from the Anglo-Saxons. In the course of events, the crown, so they're talking about those Anglo-Saxon groups, the crown deprived the body of the people of this power of local rule and vested it in a small number of persons in each locality who were called municipal councils, but they'd totally been appointed by the king. They were clothed with the power of filling vacancies in their number and were thus self-perpetuating bodies. So once they were in, you couldn't get rid of them. In this way, the ancient freedom of the municipalities was undermined, and the power of the ruling classes was installed in its place. Such was the nature of the local self-government in England, not merely during the period of the planting of the American colonies, but for a century later. It was a noble form, robbed of its life-giving spirit. So the same problem was happening in England under the crown.
The founders were determined to protect the freedom of the individual and provide a healthy climate for self-government. Only those things which related to the interest of the entire Commonwealth were to be delegated to the central government. Thomas Jefferson said, "The way to have good and safe government is not to trust it all to one, but to divide it among the many, distributing to everyone exactly the functions he is competent to perform best. Let the national government be entrusted with the defense of the nation and its foreign and federal relations, the state governments with the civil rights, laws, police, and administration of what concerns the states generally, the counties with the local concern of the counties, and each ward or township direct the interests within itself. It is by dividing and subdividing these republics," he calls them each republics, "from the great national one down through all its subordinations, now get this, until it ends in the administration of every man's farm by himself, by placing under everyone what his own eye may superintend, that all will be done for the best." And this is just interesting and powerful.
This is still Jefferson.
This is still Jefferson. "What has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun?
And
The
this is the man who studied them
generalizing
all.
and concentrating all cares and powers into one body." And I would just say, if you knew the regulations that were going on with every man's farm, it is no longer by himself because of the way the government is regulating the property of everyone, and especially the farmers right now, under alarmist things. This is what destroys liberty, and they do not have the liberty that they used to have. They're told they have to, get rid of part of their cattle because it's causing a problem with the environment. I mean, nobody should be able to come in and say you have to destroy your property. But that's what we've.
Or that you can't sell your property, or you can't
Yes.
improve your property.
Go ahead.
So Madison said it in Federalist 45, the powers delegated by the proposed constitution to the federal government are few and defined. And that's it. War, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. That's it. And look what they have taken on in the name of general welfare, which is mentioned in the preamble only. And then he says those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. All the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concerns the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and their internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. We don't do that anymore.
This is a prophecy by John Fiske, and he said, "If the day should ever arrive, which God forbid, when the people of the different parts of our country shall allow their local affairs to be administered by prefects sent from Washington, and when the self-government of the states shall have been so far lost as that of the departments of France, or even so closely limited as that of England, on that day the political career of the American people will have been robbed of its most interesting and valuable features, and the usefulness of this nation will be lamentably impaired. So
The reason we feel like it was prophetic, that's I think what Skousen called it. It's just that thing again, you can test and measure it and see that
Yeah.
that's exactly what's happened because of the departure.
So once again, thank you
There we
for.
went. Speed of light again. How you
We
doing?
know it takes your time, but we're so grateful that you did come. And next
Mhm.
week is our last one, and there's just so much in that one. If you can possibly come next week, we just kind of plead that you will.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And like I said, the book is just such a great place to
And
start.
we
too.
never
Any
stopped
comments?
if anybody had any questions. I can't be more sorry about that. Did anybody have any questions?
Oh, and do you want to stop the recording before this part or not?
I don't, does anybody have, if nobody has any questions, I am going to stop the recording. Okay. When I'm gonna stop it when I can figure out how to. Okay. Okay, I mean, I think I did it. You guys can all see my screen, right? Did I do it? Pause recording, stop recording.
It says